Section 13 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 7. Health, Disease, and Sanitation. Part 3. The Plague. The greatest scourge among the epidemics which have devastated the world is the Eastern bubonic plague, which entered Europe for the first time in the 14th century. All epidemics, when they find a new field, appear to be specially virulent, and this was the case with the first appearance of the plague, which so terrified the inhabitants of Europe that they applied to it this ominous name. But the epidemic of 1349 has of late years received the new name of the Black Death, which distinguishes it in the popular mind from the later visitations. The name, which came from Germany, will not be found in the old descriptions of the plague in England. A writer in the Quarterly Review says, quote, "The term der schwarze Tod may have been used in Germany in the 14th century, but it does not seem to have been current in England before Hecker's work on epidemics was translated into English in 1833. End quote. The Black Death entered Dorsetshire in August 1348, moving on to Bristol, Gloucester, and Oxford. From Oxford, the infection marched to London, which city it reached at Michaelmas or November. It soon swept over the whole country. Dr. Creighton writes, quote, "The Black Death may be said to have extended over 3 seasons in the British Islands. A partial season in the south of England in 1348, a great season all over England, in Ireland, and in the south of Scotland in 1349, and a late extension in Scotland generally in 1350. The experience of all Europe was similar, the Mediterranean provinces receiving the infection as early as 1347, and the northern countries on the Baltic and North Seas as late as 1350. End quote. This plague had the most momentous effect upon the history of England, on account of the fearful mortality that it caused. It paralyzed industry, and permanently altered the position of the laborer. Ineffectual attempts were made to neutralize these effects by the Statute of Laborers and by enactments, quote, "that every workman and laborer shall do his work just as he used before the pestilence, that the servants of substantial people shall take no more than they used to take, and that laborers and workmen who will not work shall be arrested and imprisoned." End quote. The effects of the pestilence on the church and on morals is seen in the writings of Wycliffe and Langland. Wycliffe, who was an Oxford student, in 1348 predicted in his book, The Last Age of the Church, the end of the world in 1400 at latest. The effect upon architecture has been dwelt upon by the antiquaries, upon the growth of the country by political economists, and upon the general health of the country by doctors, so that it is not necessary here to enter into further explanations. The statistics of the writers of the Middle Ages are of little value, and the estimates of those who died are very various. But the statement that half the population of England died from the plague is probably not far from the truth. In East Anglia, which suffered most severely, upwards of 800 parishes lost their parsons, 83 of them twice, and 10 of them 3 times in a few months. In Norfolk and Suffolk, 19 religious houses were left without abbot or prior. The details of the Black Death in London are not numerous, but Riley gives some particulars of mortality among the city companies at this time. In the Articles of the Cutlers, 1344, the names of 8 wardens are given, and below it is stated that in the 23rd year of Edward III's reign, 5 years after, they were all dead, and others chosen in their place. In the Articles of the Hatters, 1347, 6 wardens are named as being chosen on Tuesday after the feast of St. Lucy, 13th of December, 21 Edward III, and a note is added that by the Saturday after the translation of St. Thomas the Martyr, 7th of July, 24 Edward III, they had all died. 4 wardens of the Goldsmiths' Company are recorded to have fallen victims to the Black Death, and doubtless the other companies suffered in a like manner. The most striking fact in respect to the mortality in London is that recorded by Stowe in his Chronicle, of 50,000 persons buried in Sir Walter de Manny's burial place in Spittal Croft, now the Charterhouse. Although doubtless the number is grossly exaggerated, it is certain that it was very great. One of the victims in high places was Dr. Bradwardine, Archbishop of Canterbury, who died at Lambeth on the 26th of August, 1349, just 1 week after he had landed at Dover from Avignon. In January 1349, the meeting of Parliament was prorogued because, quote, a sudden visitation of deadly pestilence had broken out at Westminster and the neighbourhood. End quote. Dr. Creighton writes, quote, for 300 years, plague was the grand zymotic disease of England. The same type of plague that came from the East in 1347 to 1349 continuously reproduced in a succession of epidemics at one place or another. End quote. He goes on to quote Peinlich's Pest in Steiermark, i.e. Styria, 1877 to 1878, to show that similar cases occurred over Europe. From 1349 to 1716, 70 years are marked in the annals of Styria as plague years. The second great pestilence occurred in 1361, when the number of deaths was about 1/3 of those from the plague of 1349. The mortality was greater among men than women. The third pestilence, of 1368 to 1369, is referred to by Langland in Piers Plowman. The fourth was in 1375 to 1376, and the fifth in 1390 to 1391. Dr. Creighton describes several other plagues, and writes that, quote, in the decade from 1430 to 1440, there were no fewer than 4 distinct outbreaks of plague, 3 of them confined to London, and one of them, that of 1439, general throughout the realm. End quote. The constant recurrence of the plague must have taught the authorities some mode of treatment, but although certain sanitary regulations were made, which will be referred to later on, it is only incidentally that we learn what was done during the earlier visitations. Probably panic reigned generally in the time of the Black Death. Such writings as are left us give this impression, and there is little reason for surprise that it should have been so. Dr. Creighton has entered very fully into the history of the various plagues and the different expedients which were adopted to mitigate their severity. His valuable work is so thorough in its treatment of the subject that to a great extent I have drawn the following particulars from his luminous pages. The first plague order, of which the full text is extant, was issued in 1543. The following transcript is taken from an abstract of several orders relating to the plague. British Museum, additional manuscript number 4376. Quote, 35 Henry VIII. A precept issued to the aldermen, that they should cause their beadles to set the sign of the cross on every house which should be afflicted with the plague, and there continue for 40 days, that no person who was able to live by himself, and should be afflicted with the plague, should go abroad or into any company for 1 month after his sickness, and that all others who could not live without their daily labour should, as much as in them lay, refrain from going abroad, and should for 40 days after, illegible word, and continually carry a white rod in their hand, 2 foot long. That every person whose house had been infected should, after a visitation, carry all the straw and, illegible word, in the night privately in the fields and burn, They shall also carry clothes of the infected in the fields to be cured. That no housekeeper should put any person diseased out of his house into the street or other place unless they provided housing for them in some other house. That all persons having any dogs in their house, other than hounds, spaniels, or mastiffs necessary for the custody or safe keeping of their houses, should forthwith convey them out of the city, or cause them to be killed and carried out of the city and buried at the common laystall. That such as kept hounds, spaniels, or mastiffs should not suffer them to go abroad, but closely confine them. That the church wardens of every parish should employ somebody to keep out all common beggars out of churches on holy days, and cause them to remain without doors. That all the streets, lanes, etc., within the wards should be cleansed. That the alderman should cause this precept to be read in the churches. End quote. Dr. Creighton says that this order was a development of the measures devised by the king or his minister before 1518, and probably in the plague of 1513. The wisps put out on the infected houses are replaced by crosses, which above are described simply as the sign of the cross. On the 15th of November 1547, it was ordered by the mayor, recorder, and aldermen, vice-comites, that, quote, every householder of their several wards, which sith the feast of All Saints last past, hath been visited with the plague, shall cause to be fixed upon the uttermost post of their street door a certain cross of Saint Anthony devised for that purpose, there to remain 40 days after the setting up thereof. End quote. The cross of St. Anthony was a crutch, such as was used by the crutched friars. It was painted in blue on canvas or board, and the legend under or over the cross was, Lord, have mercy upon us. In the plague of 1563 it was ordered, on the 3rd of July, that 200 blue headless crosses be made with all convenient speed by the Chamberlain, and again, on the 6th of the same month, 200 more were ordered. On the 8th of July, blue crosses were delivered to the bailiff of Finsbury to be used there. Dr. Creighton says that before the plague of 1603, the colour of the crosses had been changed to red. The white rod or wand was used in France as well as in England, as we learn from a letter of the Venetian ambassador to France, the 20th of November, 1580. Quote, this city, Paris, I hear is in a very fair sanitary condition. Notwithstanding that, as I entered a city gate, which is close to where I resided, I met a man and a woman bearing the white plague wands in their hands, and asking alms. But some believe that this was merely an artifice on their part to gain money. End quote. The white wand was afterwards retained as the peculiar badge of the searchers of infected houses and of the bearers of the dead. In 1603 it had become a red wand, just as the blue cross had become a red one. The regulation about dogs is of great interest, as it incidentally shows that dogs were commonly kept in London houses for the purpose of protection. It was believed that dogs carried infection in their hair. Brasbridge, in his Poor Man's Duel, 1578, relates how, quote, not many years since, I knew a glover in Oxford who, with his family, to the number of 10 or 11 persons, died of the plague, which was said to be brought into the house by a dog skin that his wife bought when the disease was in the city. End quote. The plague orders contained the clause against dogs to the last, and thousands of them were killed. A proclamation during the London plague of 1563 was directed against cats as well as dogs. The early literature of the plague is very unsatisfactory, and we have to come to a time much later than the medieval period for information as to treatment. The main points of the various regulations were isolation of the infected and special attention to sanitation. These, in principle, are in accord with the best opinion of today, but the way in which they were carried out left much to be desired. Those who were imprisoned in their houses must have felt that they were given over to death. Yet some of these patients did recover, and we naturally ask, what was the treatment which caused these cures? Was the cure due to the doctor or to nature alone? The answer is not easy to find. Dr. Payne, in his inaugural address as President of the Epidemiological Society in 1893, specially alludes to the literature of the plague, of which he says, quote, "The number of publications relating to the plague in Europe during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries is very large, those in Germany being probably the most numerous, while those published in England are comparatively few. We might expect, however, that those works published at the time of great epidemics would furnish us with valuable material for epidemic history. It is very disappointing, therefore, to find how very seldom these writings, whether of continental or English origin, have any historical value. What generally happened was this. When an epidemic broke out, or was expected in any particular place, some local physician thought it his business to furnish the public with a tract on the subject, and he accordingly compiled from the best authorities a pamphlet, good or bad, as the case might be. Such a physician, if he survived, would no doubt have been able to acquire some experience of the disease during its continuance, and if he had chosen to put this down in plain words when the epidemic was over, he might have done some service to medical history. But unfortunately, when the disease had once disappeared, the physicians seem to have lost all interest in the subject, and it is only in rare instances that the medical literature of the plague contains any account of contemporary epidemics. One exception is Guy de Chauliac's well-known account of the Black Death at Avignon, but we have nothing in English literature to compare at all with this till much later. The only medical work on the plague in the Elizabethan times which has much value is that of Thomas Edge, and this cannot be called original. It is not till after the Great Plague of 1665 that we have, in the well-known work of Nathaniel Hodges, Loimologia sive pestis narratio, 1672, some attempt at a scientific description of the epidemic." End quote. Dr. Furnivall has printed in his edition of Vicary some extracts from the Guildhall repertories relating to the appointment and payment of surgeons and physicians to attend the plague-stricken folk. William King, surgeon to the pest house, petitioned for a pension in 1611. He affirms that he had shown, quote, "great care and diligence in curing of such persons as have been sent thither, and by reason of his attendance and employment there, his friends and former acquaintances do utterly refuse to use him in his profession." End quote. On September 10th, the city authorities agreed to give King a stipend of £3 a year, which does not seem very liberal pay for his onerous services. In the British Museum there is a manuscript of some importance, Sloane Manuscript 349, entitled Loimographia, an account of the Great Plague of London in the year 1665, by William Boghurst, apothecary. This was first referred to by Mr. E. W. Brayley in his edition of Defoe's Plague Year, and it was analysed by Dr. Creighton in his work on epidemics. Dr. Payne printed an edition of the tract in 1894. Mr. Brayley reprinted from the Intelligencer, July 31st, 1665, the following curious advertisement. Quote, "Whereas William Boghurst, apothecary at the White Hart in St. Giles in the Fields, hath administered a long time to such as have been afflicted with the plague, to the number of 40, 50, or 60 patients a day, with wonderful success, by God's blessing upon certain excellent medicines which he hath, as a water, a lozenge, etc. Also an electuary antidote of but 8d. the ounce price. This is to notify that the said Boghurst is willing to attend any person infected and desiring his attendance, either in the city, suburbs, or country, upon reasonable terms, and that the remedies above mentioned are to be had at his house or shop at the White Hart aforesaid." End quote. Boghurst gives a good deal of information in his book regarding the signs of disease and its treatment, and he describes the spread of the disease in London as follows. Quote, "The winds blowing westward so long together, from before Christmas until July, about 7 months, was the cause the plague began first at the west end of the city, as at St. Giles, St. Martin's, Westminster. Afterwards, it gradually insinuated and crept down Holborn and the Strand, and then into the city, and at last to the east of the suburbs, so that it was half a year at the west end of the city before the East End and Stepney was infected, which was about the middle of July. Southwark, being the south suburb, was infected almost as soon as the West End. The disease spread not altogether by contagion at first, nor began at only one place, and spread further and further as an eating spreading sore doth all over the body, but fell upon several places of the city and suburbs like rain, even at the first at St. Giles, St. Martin's, Chancery Lane, Southwark, and some places within the city, as at Proctor's House." End quote. Dr. Payne writes, quote, "It has always been a question whether the repeated recurrences of plague in Europe were to be attributed to reintroduction of the virus from the East, or to a fresh awakening of a virus already endemic." End quote, and then alludes to Boghurst's local explanation of the origin of the 1665 plague. He concludes his introductory by saying, quote, "It seems probable that London still contains sufficient plague virus to start a fresh epidemic, when the local and temporary conditions were favorable. The only temporary conditions of this kind that we know of are, first, the rapid growth of population in London, which caused terrible overcrowding, and must have overtasked the ordinary measures of sanitation, and, secondly, the long drought in the spring of 1665, which is referred to by Boghurst. The importance of this latter fact has been explained by Dr. Creighton, in accordance with Pettenkoffer's laws, but, on the other hand, the great plague year of 1625 was remarkably wet. The question is still one for discussion, and it may be left to the judgment of the reader, guided by the valuable materials which Boghurst contributes." End quote. From 1348 to 1665, plague was continually occurring in London, but it has not appeared since the last date on anything but a small scale. It has been supposed that in the Great Fire the seeds of disease were destroyed, but this is not a conclusive reason, and fears were expressed as to its possible reappearance in London after the plague of Bombay in 1896 to 1897, and the plague of Marseille in the summer of 1720 created a panic throughout Western Europe. Renewed attention was paid to the London plague of 1665, and in 1722 Defoe wrote his renowned Journal of the Plague Year. We have no thoroughly trustworthy statistics of the earlier plagues, but Dr. Creighton gives particulars of the visitations in London in 1603, 1625, and 1665 in one table. Year 1603. Estimated population 250,000. Total deaths 42,940. Plague deaths 33,347. Highest mortality in a week 3,385. Worst week 25th of August to the 1st of September. Year 1625. Estimated population 320,000. Total deaths 63,001. Plague deaths 41,313. Highest mortality in a week 5,205. Worst week 11th to the 18th of August. Year 1665. Estimated population 460,000. Total deaths 97,306. Plague deaths 68,596. Highest mortality in a week 8,297. Worst week 12th to the 19th of September. To these figures may be added that, in 1593, 11,503 persons died of the plague. The figures of 1603 and 1625 in some reports differ from the above. Footnote: in a broadside referring to the Plague of London, printed by Peter Cole at the printing office in Cornhill, near the Royal Exchange, 1665, the number of deaths from plague in 1603, 1625, and 1636 are given as follows. 1603, 30,561 persons. 1625, 35,403. And 1636, 10,400. The numbers in 1593 are given as above. End of footnote. Some of the plagues devastated the whole country, so that there was no place for the Londoners to fly to for safety. But in others, the danger was more generally confined to London. In 1665, there were many places that the Londoner could visit with considerable chance of safety, but Queen Elizabeth, in her reign, would have none of this moving about. Stowe says that in the time of the plague of 1563, quote, "A gallows was set up in the marketplace of Windsor to hang all such as should come there from London. No wares to be brought to, or through, or by Windsor, nor any one on the river by Windsor to carry wood or other stuff to or from London, upon pain of hanging without any judgment. And such people as received any wares out of London into Windsor were turned out of their houses, and their houses shut up." End quote. Monk, Duke of Albemarle, and Samuel Pepys were two of the most prominent public servants who remained in London during the plague of 1665. The clergy and the doctors fled, with very few exceptions, and several of those who stayed in town, doing the duty of others as well as their own, fell victims to the disease. Dr. Hodges, author of Loimologia, enumerates among those who assisted in the dangerous work of restraining the progress of the infection, the learned Dr. Gibson, Regius Professor at Cambridge, Dr. Francis Glisson, Dr. Nathaniel Paget, Dr. Peter Barwick, Dr. Humphrey Brooks, etc. Of those he mentions, 8 or 9 fell in their work, among whom was Dr. William Conyers, to whose goodness and humanity he bears the most honourable testimony. Dr. Alexander Burnet, of Fenchurch Street, one of Pepys' friends, was another of the victims. Footnote: Mr. Pearce gives some interesting facts in his Annals of Christ's Hospital respecting the effects of the plague in 1603 and 1665 on the condition of the Bluecoat School. During 1665, no more than 32 children of the total number of 260 in the house died of all diseases, although the neighbourhood was severely visited. End of footnote. Sweating sickness. The sweating sickness did not appear until the end of the Middle Ages, viz., the year 1485, when the Battle of Bosworth was fought, and there were 5 outbreaks of the epidemic up to 1551, after which date it did not appear again in England. Dr. Creighton has taken some pains to trace the origin of the disease. He writes, quote, "The history of the English sweat presents to the student of epidemics much that is paradoxical, although not without parallel, and much that his research can never rescue from uncertainty. Where did this hitherto unheard-of disease come from? Where was it in the intervals from 1485 to 1508, from 1508 to 1517, from 1517 to 1528, and from 1528 to 1551? What became of it after 1551? Why did it fall mostly on the great houses, on the king's court, on the luxurious establishments of prelates and nobles, on the richer citizens, on the lusty and well-fed, for the most part sparing the poor? Why did it avoid France when it overran the continent in 1529? No theory of the sweat can be held sufficient which does not afford some kind of answer to each of these questions, and some harmonizing of them all." End quote. Those who wish to follow these inquiries must consult Dr. Creighton's book, Suffice it to say here that the author is of opinion that suspicion falls justly on the foreign mercenaries who landed with Henry Tudor at Milford Haven on the 6th of August 1485 as the carriers of the disease. Dr. Creighton found among the British Museum manuscripts, additional manuscripts numbers 27 and 582, a treatise on the Sudor Anglicus, or English sweat, dedicated to Henry VII by the author, Thomas Forestier, M.D., a native of Normandy who lived for a time in London. Stowe says that the sickness began in London on the 21st of September and continued till the end of October. Quote, "Of the which a wonderful number died," end quote. But Forestier gives the date as the 19th. The second sweat was in 1508, when many died in the city. In August, public prayers were made at St. Paul's on account of the plague of sweat. The third epidemic was in 1517, and the fourth in 1528. On the 5th of June of the latter year, Sir Brian Tuke wrote to Bishop Tunstall that he had fled to Stepney, quote, "for fear of the infection," end quote, a servant having died in his house. Anne Boleyn, her brother George and her father caught the infection and recovered. Her brother-in-law, William Carey, died at Hunsdon. A large number of persons caught the disease, but a very considerable proportion recovered. The fifth and last outbreak was in 1551, and it is interesting to note that Dr. John Caius, the famous physician, wrote a treatise on it. Dr. Norman Moore describes this as, quote, "the first original treatise published in England, by which I mean the first treatise in which the modern idea of observing the disease and writing a complete account of what was actually seen was carried out." End quote. In Mackin's diary, it is said that, quote, "there died in London many merchants, and great rich men and women, and young men and old of the new sweat," end quote. And Sir Thomas Speke and Sir John Wallop are instanced among others. Hancock, a minister of Poole, Dorset, refers to, quote, "the posting sweat that posted from town to town through England, and was named Stopgallant, for it spared none. For there were some dancing in the court at 9 o'clock that were dead at 11. End quote. In taking stock of diseases and epidemics in London, we may note that many of the pestilences previous to the Black Death were due to famine. Dr. Creighton says of the year 1258 that, quote, "so great was the pinch in London from the failure of the crops and the want of money, that 15,000 are said to have died of famine and of a grievous and widespread pestilence that broke out about the Feast of the Trinity, 19th of May." End quote. The number is given by Matthew Paris, and Dr. Creighton adds, quote, "it suggests a larger population in the capital than we might have been disposed to credit. The same writer says that London was so full of people when the Parliament was sitting in the year before, 1257, that the city could hardly hold them all in her ample bosom. The Annals of Tewkesbury put the whole mortality from famine and fever in London in 1258 at 20,000, but the whole population did not probably exceed 40,000. End quote. Smallpox and measles were not known to the ancients, and the latter seems to have been the first noted in the 14th century. Of later diseases, the name of influenza is Italian of the 18th century, but Dr. Creighton refers to several epidemics which may have been the same disease as those of 1173, 1427, 1510, and 1557. The new disease of 1643 was either typhus or influenza. End of Chapter 7, Part 3. End of Section 13.